We're out here in the field at Tall Timbers Research Station. I'm with Kevin Robertson, and we're in a pretty special place because we're in what they call the Stoddard Plots. And Kevin, you want to tell us a little bit about what the significance is of this place that we're sitting in right here?
Well, one thing is that these plots have been burned since 1960s when the experiment was set up by Herbert Stoddard. So this particular plot, yeah, 60 years now. So this is a 1 year fire return interval, so it's been burned every year since then. So just knowing the fire history of it really helps us a lot in interpreting the response in terms of the ecology.
Right. Okay. So we have a 1, 2, and 3 year interval that's been since 1960, or at least.
And some that have been unburned since that time as well.
And some unburned. So we'll show you this in each of these different contexts during this video. So stay tuned.
Well, one thing you can see about this plot in general is that the aspect is dominated by grasses primarily and other forbs, and not a whole lot of woody plants. But it's not to say there aren't any woody plants in here. So, like we pointed out, this water oak, which of course can turn into a huge tree, but it's kept in this very minute form by the frequent burning. The research that we've done shows that these plants almost always do resprout, which is pretty amazing by itself. So we don't even know how old the genetic individual of this little water oak is. Yeah, it could be decades old for all we know.
That's another incredible thing, like the fact that there are even any stems left in here. You know, presumably some of them may have been here from the beginning. Even.
It could be, because they don't have much of an opportunity to get established by seed when you're burning annually like that.
Yeah.
Especially when they disperse in the late fall and they're coming up as seedlings right about the time that we burn them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a good chance that these little resprouts have been here for a very long time. Which is important understanding with prescribed burning, is to not have the expectation that you're going to eliminate woody plants, but you're really just managing them.
Yeah.
You're keeping them in this kind of balance with the other aspects of the plant community.
Sure.
And in the case of an annual burn, you're really tipping it towards the grass side and away from the woody plant side. But all the pieces are still here, and they could be shifted a different way with a shift in the fire regime.
Right.
And of course, if you took fire out altogether, this would turn into a hardwood forest again. Right. It takes a long term under a particular fire regime to change the structure of the vegetation, not just 2 fires in a row.
Sure, especially when you want compositional shifts that drive that structural change. So really appreciate you talking about it. And let's go look at these other plots and see what these resprouting things look like there.
Sure.
Okay, so now we're in a 2-year Stoddard plot. So now the fire has been burned at least since 1960 on a 2-year interval, where every other year we're getting fire. And I thought it was pretty fascinating. One, we still have a fair amount of grass in there, but there's certainly some other types of plants that are invading this. There's something that's really telling about the difference in just, you know, whether you're burning annually versus every other year in this system, is to look at this water oak here now and compare it to that last one that you just looked at.
Right, this one was top killed at the same time approximately as the last water oak, about a year ago. And this one must be about 5, 6, 7 times bigger, even though it's been the same amount of time since it was top killed. You can actually see the dead stem that was killed before standing right next to it, and then it resprouted again. But with a 2-year fire interval, it's got twice as much time between each fire to grow, photosynthesize, produce root mass, which provides more storage for the plant to resprout when it gets top killed again. And as you can imagine, if you started burning this annually, this wouldn't suddenly go back to being a 7-inch water oak. It would take a while for it to start getting
as it depletes those resources. Yeah,
small over time.
Great point. Yeah, I think that's really interesting and a pretty cool look at this. Let's look at the 3-year interval.
Sure.
Okay, so we're still in the Stoddard plots, and I know this looks really different. In fact, it's so different we had to stand up for this part of the segment. We wanted to show you a water oak again. Now, we know that it looks different, but it's not because it's been a different time since it was burned. Those other plots we were standing in were 10 months since fire. This is 10 months since fire as well. But now we have 60 years on a 3-year return interval. So
all the difference a year makes in that interval.
So now we've just had a year longer in between fires that this plant has had to develop that root system that you were talking about. Yeah. And it's pretty incredible how much resources it can build up over time to put into growth.
And we've actually excavated some of the roots in this system, and it's pretty much like solid roots underground, which is why you don't see a lot of herbaceous vegetation. You see these tall woody resprouts, and you don't see the grasses that we saw in the one of the 2-year plots. The species richness has gone down quite a bit too on a per meter basis or a small scale basis compared to those other sites.
And is it because, do you think because these plants are much more effective at out-competing those plants?
I think it is. It's a combination of root competition and shading, all combined together.
Yeah.
And also those herbaceous plants receive a benefit from being top killed and having that light environment. They respond to that with resprouting.
Yeah, they're really well adapted
to grazing or herbivory.
So, if we were going to think about community diversity in the 3 plots, the first one we looked at with the annual, is that the highest diversity?
Yes, and it's specifically at smaller scales. So
right.
if you look at the whole plot scale, you could probably find all those species somewhere.
Yeah.
But if you looked at maybe like a 10 meter square plot, then they would have the highest where you burn the most frequently.
Okay, so the most frequent burning is the highest diversity, at least at small scales. The 2-year is sort of intermediate, I take it, and then the 3-year is lower diversity.
That's right.
If we're looking at the landscape scale, having some places that maybe even never have fire in it, or very rarely, they might actually benefit the community by having a few of those fire species colonized that wouldn't necessarily be able to otherwise.
Right. So species like magnolia, for example, or holly and yopon, beech, and ironwood, some species like that are typical of fire excluded systems would start to creep in, and we did see that in an experiment on tall timbers where we've excluded fire, including some of the Stoddard plots.
Can we go and take a look at the Stoddard plot that hasn't had fire in it?
Sure.
Okay, let's go look at that.
Okay.
So now we're in the fire excluded or the no fire treatment for the Stoddard plot. So the effects we're looking at are based on fire.
Absolutely.
And obviously, if you look around us, we're now in a very different context. It feels like a completely different forest type. I mean, it's just a completely different thing that we're standing in. And, this is an example of not having fire in the same system. It would look just like any of those other ones if we had frequent fire, but now we've not had fire for 60 years.
Right. This is what much of the southeast looks like because of fire exclusion.
Yeah. So if you're familiar with seeing this type of plant community, that's why, right? It is largely because of fire exclusion.
So behind us right here, we have a water oak. And this probably was one of those little resprouting plants that came back to about that size every year until the ending fire freed it up and allowed it to continue growing into this big tree.
Sure.
Now, one of the consequences you can see is in the ground, the herbaceous vegetation is almost completely gone.
Right.
About the only thing we have here is some catbrier and things like poison ivy, the type of thing you might find in a shady backyard.
Mm-hmm.
Tremendous loss of diversity in terms of plant species.
Right.
Now, there might be some reason to believe that if you give it another few hundred years, this could turn into yet a different community type, like a beech magnolia, holly spruce pine type habitat. But most of these species are still kind of the weedy, early successional, water oak, sweet gum type of thing.
Yeah, so you're still thinking of this as early succession in that time scale.
That's right. But we do have like a magnolia over there, and you could probably find some other species that are suggestive of that slow shift to a different community type. But it would take an awful long time.
Yeah. So, really interesting. I appreciate you giving us a tour of the Stoddard plots. I think it's such an awesome experiment to have this, this visual of what happens after that long under different fire regimes.
Yeah, sure. 50 years from now, we'll learn even more.
Yeah, probably so.